And I'll tweet the link shortly, so feel free to retweet it or not. I always I always make sure to invite the losers and the haters to join.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
they're uh, they're usually involved.
Seems reasonable to me.
In fact, I encourage them to join because I feed we all I think, or at least I feed on their hatred.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's always good to have people who might not necessarily be in our camp engaged with us.
Yeah. Well, be careful what you wish for.
Huh. Fair enough.
Okay, I thought I could send the link from my phone because my system slows down slightly when I have the Hangout open, but the phone method did not work, so that's fine. Just gonna take a minute or so.
Yeah, no worries. We're still a little early, right?
We are early. Time is on our side.
Huh.
Okay, composing the tweet. Oops.
Do I still have
I
a
don't.
minute?
I leave this initial portion on the video so people have to suffer through
Okay,
it. So I don't do any editing at all.
no worries.
That's we have to make. I like it raw.
People know they're getting the real thing that way.
Yeah. Okay, link has been tweeted,
Cool. I'll
which is
retweet.
the semi-official beginning of the discussion, I guess. So if you want to retweet that out or whatever. Um, okay, so um, the basic impetus, I would say, for this discussion is that you've been speaking kind of generally about the ethics of third-party voting, and you're a declared supporter of Jill Stein. Um, I've been thinking about the ethics of abstentionism, and to what degree a conscious abstention from voting is um, has any kind of ethically normative qualities that make it a desirable um, course of action. Um, but I guess a good way to broach the conversation, and we'll get into our both of our what we'll both be doing for just in terms of our activities in the voting booth or not. But I think a good way to start off the conversation is just to put out what I see to be a fallacy in the way that these things are generally talked about and see if you agree, which is that the tenor of or the way that people who opt for a third party, the way that their choice is framed, is that they themselves have the onus to reconcile themselves to, say, Hillary, rather than Hillary having the burden of appealing to these people and courting their votes. So it seems like what people tend to do is they invert the burden. So the candidate has the burden of proof. The candidate is the one who has to demonstrate to a voter that the voter ought to go and cast their ballot for that candidate. It's not the other way around, where it's somehow incumbent on the voter himself or herself to just suck it up and get with the program and vote for X. So it seems to me like this kind of prevailing view of I guess third party voting in particular, but voting more broadly, has kind of distorted the analytical sort of framework in the way that this is discussed generally. Does that seem accurate to you?
So yeah, I do think that that is correct from an analytical standpoint. Although I actually think that we're on less firm ground having that argument than the argument about actual strategy and voting outcomes, because I think a lot of the vitriol directed at third party voters and non voters is from people who say you're living in this abstract analytical world where you want things to be a certain way, and maybe I agree with you that they should be a way that is different than it is today, but it's not, and we have to think about the real world consequences of our actions. And I think if we stay in that analytical framework, we then suggest that there is not a strategic component to what we are doing in a very real world sense. And I think there's actually a very compelling and important strategic reason for casting a third party vote or abstaining from voting that is not often grappled with by people who choose to vote for a major party candidate.
Yeah, but there may be multiple components to the rationale for abstention or for third party voting, but any one individual voter doesn't necessarily have to embrace every single component in their particular strategic analysis for their course of action, right? So
Yeah, no, I think that's
it could be sufficient for one, say, voter X, Fred, to say, I'm content to stay in this analytical realm. I mean, that meets a sufficient burden for me to dictate my course of action. So who is anybody else necessarily to say, no, you need to adopt additional components to guide your behavior? It seems like, everybody has a different standard for determining what they'll do or not do in terms of voting. Does that seem right?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I definitely agree with that. I guess all I'm saying is I think the more compelling argument is the strategic one to me, because while I do completely agree from an analytical standpoint about the burden should be on the candidate rather than the voter, the way that I guess I think about my decision to vote third party is much more in the what is the objective that I'm trying to accomplish, and do I think that this furthers that objective? And I think if I came to a different conclusion about what the likely outcome would be of my vote, I would probably think about things a little differently on a personal level. But I completely agree with you that that I think people will think about this stuff in a different way. I just think the strategic rationale is the most compelling one.
Right. So you accept that there's sort of a multiplicity of reasons that people might adopt, and each are sound, perhaps in their own right. But you're saying that your rationale that's more grounded in a practical strategic analysis is the superior one, or at least superior for your purposes.
Yeah, it's the one that speaks most to me. I mean, again, I think where you're definitely right is for each individual person. I think an evaluation of values is something that everybody has to do, and I always kind of feel like disagreements about kind of value issues or approach to issues are things that are perfectly fine for people to have as long as we're clear about what our axioms are. So I would probably disagree with the approach that abstracts voting away from what are the practical consequences of it. But if somebody has a very different perspective of the world, I would just have to acknowledge that they have a different perspective of the world, even if I disagree with it.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to kick off the conversation on that note is because last night I tweeted a photo of a mailer that's been being sent around in Florida, and I think you commented on it.
I
Which
did, yeah.
basically,
That's the
is
LCD, right?
yeah. So the League of Conservation Voters Action Fund, which I guess is the super PAC or PAC for the League of Conservation Voters. They've launched an initiative in at least one state, I think multiple, but the one that I happened to see was for Florida, and they're specifically trying to dissuade, I guess Democratic leaning voters or maybe voters writ large to vote for the third-party candidates because it will, quote, help Trump. So they put this dubiously sourced graphic of Clinton with a small lead over Trump from some poll from like a month or two ago, and was brandishing that as evidence that if you vote for Stein or Johnson, you're helping Trump. And to me, there's so many ways that's fallacious. I think, and I think it's worth just parsing them quickly, and then we'll kind of move on to the related arguments. But so when somebody says you're helping Trump if you're voting for this third-party candidate, so in this case it's either Johnson or Stein, either of them is seen as just a vehicle for helping Trump because the automatic assumption is that they're going to be taking votes away from Hillary. So to me, the causality of that formulation is just dead wrong. I mean, from just a straight analytical perspective, what causes Trump to garner sufficient votes to become president, theoretically, right? It's a certain number of people voting for Trump in a state such that he wins a plurality of votes. So if you're not doing that, then you're not taking an action which actually, in a literal sense, helps Trump. The only way you help Trump, so to say, is if you vote for Trump. But it seems like there's this kind of cynical conflation game going on where there's the causal linkage is so kind of ill considered, and it's used sort of as a weapon to disparage people who are contemplating a third party vote. I don't know, was that the way you thought about that, Mailer?
So there, a large part of that I agree with. I think what I would say is I think the assumption that voting for a third-party candidate helps Trump is predicated upon a baseline of your vote would otherwise go to Clinton is the assumption. So the idea is Clinton is supposed to be getting my vote, and that instead of giving it to her, I'm giving it to Jill Stein or Gary Johnson. And if I were to give it to her instead, it would be less likely for Trump to win the election. I do think one thing that is very clearly wrong about the way a lot of people see third-party voting as helping Trump is even if I stipulate that to be true, that my other option would be voting for Clinton, and therefore she is getting one less vote due to my decision than she would otherwise have. I would say that's still very different from voting for Trump, because if I were to vote for Trump, as you said, that would be an affirmative vote in his column, as well as not giving Clinton the +1 that she might otherwise get. So it's at most 50% helping Trump relative to a vote for Trump, if you assume that the alternative is a vote for Clinton. Now, I tend to agree with you that the assumption that the alternative is a vote for Clinton is wrong. And especially in the case of that League of Conservation Voters mailer, the thing that's wrong about it is there's an assumption that all of these people who are voting for Johnson, that their second choice would be Clinton, or even that all these people voting for Stein, their second choice would be Clinton rather than another option. And I don't think that we have the information to know that that's true. I mean, we've seen some polling data to suggest that Johnson is pulling a surprising number of voters whose second or third choice would otherwise be Clinton instead of Trump, relative to what you would typically think for a libertarian. But I haven't seen anything to suggest that we know definitively that when Gary Johnson and Jill Stein have a certain percentage in a given state, that that's necessarily vote totals where the second or third choice for those people would be Clinton relative to Trump. That's just an area where I see it slightly differently, I guess. But in general, I think you're right that it's kind of, there's a fallacy in the assumption, and I think it also very much discounts the trade-offs involved in that calculation, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, and even where data does exist that suggests an inordinate or or a substantial portion of prospective Johnson voters do indicate Clinton as their second choice. Indicating someone as a second choice doesn't necessarily mean that you would otherwise vote for that choice. I mean, so it's just that, if you had a gun to your head and you had to express a preference, Trump or Clinton, and you say Clinton, that doesn't translate to I would therefore vote for Clinton under X circumstance, right? It's just an expression of a preference in the abstract. So there needs to be so even that data alone, I don't think would be sufficient to categorize a person as someone who would have otherwise voted for Clinton. So that's another layer of fallacy, I think. The polling data it's useful in a sense. I mean, but it's not. When you're talking about individual choices, people have multiple layers in terms of what act they end up taking. So there's like a pyramid of different factors that they weigh with different levels of weight. And just because they happen to express a preference, Trump v. Clinton, doesn't necessarily mean that they would therefore vote for Clinton under a different circumstance.
Yeah, no, I think that's true to an extent. I mean, I guess the question that I would ask is, if one were to categorize our voting choices in a presidential election, I would say they are Trump, Clinton, Johnson, Stein, Evan McMullin, any other third-party candidate who happens to be on your ballot, a write-in candidate of your choosing, and then abstaining from voting. And I guess my question in that is, at some level, you could compare each of those potential choices to the others. And I would say that it is more beneficial for Trump for me to choose one of the non-Clinton choices than to choose the Clinton choice, given the realities of our political system. I think that that's true. It's not as beneficial for Trump, I think, as most people make it out to be. But relative to that other option, I do think that there is some benefit there. I just think it's outweighed by other factors. And I'm curious if you would agree with that or if you think that that whole premise is wrong.
Well, going back to the point that I was just making, right? So let's think of person X, Fred's hierarchy of priorities, right? So he's somebody who responds to a pollster and says he's a Johnson voter, and his second choice would be Clinton. So he's one of these people that we're thinking about.
Sure.
In that polling question, so let's say that if he were to rank his choices, it would be 1, Johnson, 2, abstain, 3, Clinton.
Okay.
So therefore, the option, it's not between, even though he might have expressed his preference for Clinton versus Trump, the rung below Johnson isn't to vote Clinton. So I don't think necessarily that can be construed as a help for Trump, because voting for Clinton wasn't a viable option for him in any case, even though he might have stated a preference for Clinton in the narrow binary versus Trump. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Although, I mean, again, I guess the point I would make, and I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself on this,
No.
but I would just say that the abstention, I would also say relative to Clinton, is more beneficial for Trump than voting for Clinton. And I guess what you're saying is that voter is assigning basically close to 0% probability that he would consider voting for Clinton, or she would consider voting for Clinton. Stein and abstention are really the only things that she's thinking of, or Johnson and abstention are the only things that she's thinking of. And so it's really a meaningless designation that she's put Clinton on there.
Yeah.
I do think, however, if I was having an argument with a Clinton voter, and I were to say the only two options I'm considering are Stein and abstention, or the only two options I'm considering are Johnson and abstention, I do think it would be a valid argument for the Clinton voter on that point alone to say, well, relative to voting for Clinton, those two choices are more beneficial for Trump. I don't think it would be legitimate for that person to say that's the same as supporting Trump, because it's clearly not.
And that's the key point, because this mailer is just one example of it, but you see it elsewhere very frequently, which is this conflation of an affirmative vote for Trump with an act that by omission might, in some convoluted analysis, help Trump in an abstract sense. Like those, to assign those equal weight in terms of significance and moral reasoning, I think that's totally fallacious.
Yeah, no,
I think that's the trap you get into when you grant some legitimacy to that theoretical Clinton person that you're arguing with. If you grant legitimacy to that mode of thinking, I think you're lending some element of credence to the motivation behind that conflation. I think that's pernicious.
Interesting. That's interesting, because I do see that a little bit differently. I mean, I guess what I would say is, so I would say that I'm aligned in goals with most people I know who are voting for Clinton in this election in terms of kind of long-term policy outcomes I'd like to see. I don't think that that's true for all Clinton voters. I don't think it's true for a lot of prominent Clinton supporters. But I would say for most people I know who are saying, I'm begrudgingly voting for Clinton in this election because I really want to stop Trump, they and I have very similar views of what we'd like to see eventually in the world. We have different conceptions of how change happens and what we do to get there. But I think that they have broadly similar goals. Now, I do think that attack is very pernicious. I 100% agree with you on that. But I also think that it is not helpful in a conversation with people like that to make the argument that there is no legitimacy to the idea that if I were to change my mind and say, you know what, you're right, I'm going to cast a vote for Clinton, that would be a net zero in terms of the practical outcomes of the election. Because I don't think it is a net zero. I think it is very different, again, from casting a vote for Trump. But what I would push that person on is there is some legitimacy to what you're saying in terms of this non-negligibly increases the chances of a candidate I like less getting elected. However, you casting a vote for Clinton non-negligibly increases the chances of bad policy outcomes from the Hillary Clinton administration. And that's the conversation that I think is really important for third-party voters, abstainers, to have with Clinton voters, is there are real downsides, significant legitimate downsides to casting a vote for the major party candidate that you dislike less, that I think those people don't give enough credence to, just like they think that we don't give enough credence to the element of risk in saying we shouldn't have a two-party system and therefore I'm going to take a different option, which I think is a perfectly legitimate choice. But I think if we don't admit that there is some downside there, then one, we're not being fully upfront with people, and two, it's much harder to convince them and help them see the downside to the choice that they're making.
Yeah, I think it's just obviously true as a matter of pure fact that if you were to say to that person that you're hypothetically dialoguing with, you're right. After all, after all these many years, I finally decided that Clinton is the right choice. Therefore going to vote for her. Yeah, that would add an additional vote to her total that she wouldn't otherwise have, right? I mean, so that's
right.
That's just like almost trivially true.
Sure.
But when you're talking about one vote in a country of 330 million people and whatever the number of registered eligible voters is, every voting decision is in a sense going to be negligible. So that's why I think it's tenable, morally and practically, to let factors beyond the pure practical impact weigh be the overriding factor in your decision making, because the likelihood that your vote is going to tip an election one way or another is infinitesimally small, right? So therefore, I think you're well within your rights and justified in selecting from a catalog of other factors in terms of what choice you're going to make.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. And actually, the first piece that I wrote about third-party voting in this election was back in, I believe, December during the primary. And I said, I think Hillary Clinton is better than the Republicans, but if Bernie Sanders loses the Democratic primary, I'm not going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and here's why. And what I lay out in that piece is kind of a conditional scenario. And the first condition is what you said, basically, either my vote matters and is going to be material to the outcome of the election, or it's not. So under the assumption that it's not, which for each individual voter probably is the correct assumption, you're right, then I think I should cast my vote in line with my principles. And there's also actually a practical reason to not support you dislike less in that scenario, because if you do withhold support, you can maybe get 5% for a third party, or you can, and I think you said this on Twitter the other day, that the reason you're abstaining is you don't want to lend legitimacy to the system by depressing overall turnout. And I think that that's a reasonable argument also for somebody to make in the scenario where your vote is not going to swing the outcome of the election. Those are real material benefits of casting a principled vote in that scenario. However, I'm often asked by people, and I think that this is a very important question. Suppose you were in a swing state and you were the deciding vote, because I would say that the block of people that I'm hoping I can convince to think about third-party voting and non-voting differently will eventually get big enough to exercise the kind of power that I'm thinking about. And so the question is, suppose that group is actually going to materially affect the outcome of the election. Meaning, if that group decided to accept the arguments of Clinton voters and vote for Clinton, Clinton could win the election. If that group decides to cast their votes for Trump, Trump could win the election. If that group decides to cast their votes for Jill Stein, Clinton might lose the election to Trump in that scenario. And people ask me, what would you do in that scenario? And my answer is I'd still vote for Jill Stein. And the reason for that is because the differences between Clinton and Trump over the next 4 years to me are scary, but they are not as scary as never having a Democratic Party that has to listen to its left wing and to the people who really want fundamental change for disadvantaged populations. Because I think what the Democratic Party does is they prey on these mailers like the LCV Action Fund sent out, and on the fears of people about Republicans who are worse than Democrats, to basically pay lip service to some progressive ideals and then undercut things that are really important for populations that we care about, perpetuate wars that are destructive for people in other countries, deport tons of people. There's still tons of people in deep poverty. There's intense systemic racism in the United States that the Democratic Party is complicit in. So to me, when I'm arguing with somebody about the virtue of third-party voting, I say, if I'm going to vote for Clinton in that scenario, I have no bargaining power over the Clinton platform. But if the Democratic Party knows that I'm going to withhold my vote, then one of two things can happen. Either the Democratic Party learns they have to actually address those issues or they'll lose elections, or two, we build a big enough coalition that we actually develop a challenge to the two-party system and have something new develop. And the third party, maybe the Greens, maybe we have a totally different electoral setup. But those are the two things that I'm working towards long-term with my third-party vote. And I do think it's a matter of trade-offs that one has to weigh. But that's the calculation that I think people should hopefully be engaged in.
Yeah, I mentioned my dramatic announcement on Twitter, I don't know when it was, 2 days ago or something.
It was very dramatic. It was great.
I did decide to abstain, and the way that you put it is maybe slightly different than how I put my rationale. It's not so much about declining to legitimize the system as such. It's about declining to legitimize this particular electoral scenario.
Okay, fair enough.
So, in 2008, yeah, maybe the system itself wasn't worthy of legitimization either, but I think it was it was ethically tenable to vote for Obama in 2008, and I did. Um,
I did too, actually.
yeah, and then so in 2016, this it's basically still the same old system, right? That's not worthy of legitimization. But what I think refraining from voting this time around will do is say it, your one vote subtracts from the overall popular vote total because you're declining to vote. If enough people do that, it'll decrease the overall rate of turnout, and that'll be seen as conferring a lesser degree of legitimacy on the outcome. So you're depriving the winner of a mandate in that sense. So theoretically diminishing their overall power and ability to implement their agenda, and you know, uh, and increasing the likelihood that they'll be removed from power as soon as possible. And make no mistake, that's what I wanted to. With whoever wins, I think either of them should be probably removed from power as soon as possible. So that would be my rationale. It's not so much about the system in an abstract sense. It's about the 2016 election. I would like to see a depressed turnout overall because then Hillary will be less able to say I have this historic incredible mandate. Here's why I can invade the world. And this goes to and she'll probably do that anyway, obviously. But based on what I can do with my own individual vote, I feel that is the rational choice this time. But I respect other choices, including voting for a third party and Jill Stein in particular, who I like on a personal level. I mean, I interviewed her a week or two ago and agree with many of her positions. So it's not a matter of necessarily disagreeing with Jill Stein, and even I think Garrett Johnson has merit in some ways and demerits in others. But
I give him I give Gary Johnson a lot of demerits. I think. Well, I mean, we don't need to get into that, but.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. But one thing that really bugs me, and tell me if this bugs you. I think we might have a slight difference on this, but who knows? It's this kind of smug assumption that any fair-minded person, without being provided argumentation or reasons or anything beyond just kind of this, this sort of like prejudged declaration. Anybody, in say your or my position, to automatically assume that Hillary is the better choice relative to Trump. And now I'm not saying that that's not true. It might well be true. But I don't like this idea that it's just assumed and it doesn't need to be demonstrated with evidence. So here would be the two pieces of countervailing evidence that's saying maybe Trump theoretically is not as bad as Clinton. And again, I'm not endorsing that view. I'm just saying I want it aired so people can, rather than just assumed, right? So Trump hasn't been consistent on all that much, right, over the course of the 2016 campaign, but he has opposed TPP from the beginning. He opposed NAFTA in the 90s. If there's one thing you can trace over the course of his political pundit career, is opposition to these kind of global trade deals that favor corporations, and he's been rallying against that, and he basically has made that a plank of the Republican platform now, which is a pretty remarkable achievement such as it is. And then and Hillary's position on TPP, as we all know, is just utterly incoherent. She's almost certainly lying about it, and she's going to reverse on it pretty quickly upon gaining power, right? So just bracket that, and then bracket foreign policy, which is Hillary has ginned up what I believe to be a war fervor with Russia. And it's extremely dangerous what she and her campaign and the Democrats, many of her Democratic allies have done in antagonizing Russia, probably spoiling the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Russia for the foreseeable future, accusing them of direct interference with the U.S. electoral process, which Hillary claims itself would be caused to retaliate militarily against them. So she says the DNC hack alone is cause enough to launch a military retaliation against Russia directly. She says Putin himself individually has attempted to thwart the U.S. electoral process on behalf of his buddy Trump. So this insane sort of Manchurian candidate conspiracy theory has been one of the central features of her campaign now for a long time.
And
And
it's
that's
super pernicious. I agree with you about that.
and then her position on Syria is no fly zone, quote unquote. Trump is opposed to that, right? So if we just grant for the time being that what they both say is what they both would actually do, Trump will be less likely to initiate war in Syria. And we don't have to necessarily grant that, but just for the
You're
purpose of
right.
this very narrow discussion, right?
Sure.
Let's just say that, right? So on foreign policy, on the Russia-Syria scenario, and the TPP, you know, I mean, maybe even with those two things being true, Clinton is still the better, the preferable winner, right? But I need an argument as to why that honestly reckons with those two things, or else it's just kind of this smug presumptiveness that I don't really like.
So that last point that you make, I 100% agree, and this is something I think is very difficult for people with power balancing values to do, I think, without getting accused of being a Trump supporter or an agent of the Kremlin. It's one of the reasons I've really appreciated your journalism and Glenn Greenwald's journalism, and those people who have been very critical of both candidates and very attuned to it's really important to not assume things, to really analyze these issues and make compelling arguments rather than just kind of throwing this idea out at voters and assuming that they should just accept it as fact. So I completely agree with you on that. And I tried to write a piece myself actually a while ago. I definitely think that Clinton is the preferable of the two candidates. And I think that to me that is pretty clear, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I also think that the differences between Clinton and Trump are vastly overstated by Democrats, and in a way that is very scary and very pernicious, because I think it tries to normalize a lot of things that are very destructive for a lot of disadvantaged people that are in Clinton's record, and that we think will likely come to fruition under a perpetuation of Democratic policy, which I would say Clinton is in some ways, I think, definitely more of a risk for that than Obama was. But there's a lot that's a continuation of some of the concerns that somebody like me would have had in 2012 when I voted for Stein as well. So I just want to be clear about that too. So the two issues that specifically you mentioned, the TPP and foreign policy, are the two issues in that piece that I wrote where I say these are specific issues where I think that it's not as clear cut. So I do agree with you on the TPP that Donald Trump has a more credible record as being opposed to trade deals than Hillary Clinton does. Now, that being said, it's really hard to tell what Donald Trump thinks about anything, and he does change his positions a lot. But I think you're right that his record suggests that he's more anti-trade deals than Clinton is. I don't think he necessarily is for the right reasons, which is a whole different issue. But I do think he is more opposed to the TPP actually than Clinton is. Then if you talk about the foreign policy stuff too, broadly, I very much agree with the way that you laid things out. I think, again, it's kind of hard to tell what Trump would do. And the thing that I would say with Trump on foreign policy is there's a lot more variance. So I think we pretty much know what we're getting with Clinton, and it's very hawkish and bad. I think when it comes to Trump, you might have something that's not quite as bad. You might have something that's worse. And it's not 100% clear which of those you would get, which to some people is very frightening, and I think that that's perfectly legitimate. However, on most other issues, and those are really the main two issues I can think of where you could make the argument it's not super clear cut, I think that Clinton is more in line with what I believe, still very far from what I believe, but more in line with what I believe than Trump is. And the other piece that I think is really important to keep in mind, because I think that this is often understated in presidential debates, is the staffs matter a lot. And so one thing that I would note about Trump, I think part of the reason, so what I argued in that piece that I think that Democrats should keep in mind is, I think there are two reasons that Republicans were so upset about the Trump nomination. I think reason number one is Trump says explicitly what a lot of Republicans play to in their platforms with dog whistles. So the racism is overt with Trump. It's been kind of part of dog whistle politics in the Republican Party for a very long time. It's been part of dog whistle politics in the Democratic Party a lot as well, not to the same extent in the Republican Party, but it's been there in the Democratic Party. But Trump brings it out into the open. And Marco Rubio had a quote in one of the presidential debates where he said something along the lines of, we're all thinking what Trump is saying, but we're smart enough not to say it out loud. That wasn't exactly what he said, but that was the gist of it. And I think it's really telling. I think, a lot of Republicans are worried about Trump because it's identifying what they're doing as what it is, when beforehand they were able to make it a little bit more covert, which to me is in many ways more dangerous. Now, I think the counter argument to that a lot of people who are afraid of Trump would make, and I think it's a legitimate counter argument, is bringing it out into the open also has downsides because it gives a platform to people who might not have had it before. It emboldens people. When you encourage a violence at a rally, for example, then it's more likely to happen. So I think that there's a legitimacy to that, but I think that that's something to keep in mind, that that's part of the reason a lot of Republicans are turned off by Trump, is because he's bringing out into the open things that they played to covertly for a while.
Let me just interject, because you mentioned, that you would agree that there is at least some ambiguity in terms of who would be preferable on the trade policy issues and foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just pause and note that those are two of the most foundational issues that the federal government has any kind of control over, especially foreign policy, given that the president can basically unilaterally conduct foreign policy. So my view has been for as long as I could vote, and probably even before, that the president's foreign policy position should take precedent in one's assessment of their relative merits and demerits, at least compared to the alternative, because the president can basically wield power in that arena unconstrained.
Because you're saying those are areas of executive action rather than you need to work with Congress.
Well, foreign policy specifically, and I think even TPP in a way, because that was negotiated with Obama's blessing, without Congress having input initially, right? So that was a presidential initiative. Now it had to be authorized. Has to be authorized ultimately by Congress, but that didn't begin in Congress. As far as maybe I'm getting the chronology wrong, but
no. I think you broadly have that right. In that those are two issues where the president does exercise more control than in other areas of their agenda. I don't think that's wrong.
Right. So why? So why is it? So then, granting that there's ambiguity on those two issues, which are foundational and which the president has a special amount of control over unilaterally, what is it about the other issues that weighs so heavily against those two? And there might be more, but let's just limit it to those two for now. That makes Trump so obviously the worst choice. Again, maybe that's true, but I would need some reasons that militate against that, right? So what's the contradicting evidence that leads to that conclusion as being so obvious and true?
So I think that's a good question, and I think it's fair to ask for that. So I think the second point that I was going to make about why I think Republicans initially disliked Trump is part of the answer to this. So what I was saying is I think part of the reason there was a lot of Republican opposition to Trump is because if you looked at his policy inclinations on economic policy, for example, prior to this election season, you might have thought that he could run as a Democrat because he wasn't quite as in line with the Republican consensus on things, on basically gutting assistance to the poor and not having any sort of social insurance or social safety net. He had positions that were different from the mainstream Republican Party in the past. Now, that is what I think was true about Trump pre this election. What I would say is I think presidential staffs matter a lot. And one of the things that we've seen during this election season is Trump has surrounded himself with a cast of characters that are pretty typical in the Republican Party, would probably take those two issues that you're talking about and militate very strongly in a direction that is at least as bad, if not worse, than Clinton. And then you couple that with kind of Trump's temperament, and you're not really sure exactly what he believes too, with policy advisors who have the mainstream Republican line on those issues. I do think, again, that even in those two arenas, even though there is some ambiguity there, I think we do want to look at who's going to surround those people, and I think they would be worse under a President Trump. The other thing that I think is, go ahead.
And you know, I think that's a fair point. And you know, the prospect of Attorney General Rudy Giuliani, I think, is really probably the most frightening aspect of a Trump presidency.
Terrifying.
And then, you know, Michael Flynn as defense secretary would probably be horrible. And so the staffing options around Trump are not particularly inspiring or pretty frightening.
No, I mean they're really big. They're actually, I would say, in terms of their policy inclinations, many of them are worse, are pretty clearly worse than Trump.
Yeah. But the one reason, something that annoys me, right, is that when pondering this calculus, a lot of Democrats and people who are just knee-jerk, Clinton is out on top in this calculus, and we don't need to provide any evidence why. That sort of person that doesn't seem to have any desire to grapple with the way in which Trump diverges from Republican orthodoxies in a potentially salutary direction, right? So they talk about Trump as if he was Rubio, or as if he was Ted Cruz, or whoever else, and they don't bother grappling with the foreign policy distinctions, the trade policy distinctions, some of the social policy distinctions. So Trump, you know, famously said something nice about LGBT people at his convention address, and you could take that for whatever you want to take that as, but he did it. And it doesn't, it's like what I don't appreciate is when, so on the one hand, they want to treat him as their generic Republican who's going to bring in a generically bad Republican staff. And on the other hand, they treat him as this enormous world historic threat. And it seems like there's sort of a discrepancy there that they don't bother attempting to reconcile.
No, and I think you're 100% right about that. I guess I was giving my rationale about why I think Clinton is the less unpreferable candidate, that if one was forced to choose, for me, it would very clearly be her. But just to drill down on it, and the most salient reason for that, like if you had to select the most salient reason, it would be the staff question. Well, so I think it would be a combination of the staff question, her domestic policy agenda is, I think, in part because of the staff issue, significantly to the left of Trump. And also, I do think that words matter, and the fact that I mean, so, and again, I see both sides of this, but on the one hand, I say the fact that Trump has been outright racist and sexist on the campaign trail, I think that exposes a lot of elements that we need to combat and people need to grapple with. So the exposure in some ways is a positive thing for us being able to fight it because it was there before and people weren't paying as much attention to it. However, I would also say that it has some very detrimental effects in terms of how you feel if you're a member of that group, in terms of what type of climate it creates of fear for people. So I do think that is a substantial and important difference as well between the candidates. Again, I mean, I am not a proponent of Hillary Clinton. I'm voting for Jill Stein. I just think that for me personally, when I look at the two candidates, I definitely think the differences between them are overstated. And I am equally frustrated with you about the arguments that you're talking about because I think that they are disingenuous and they're a real problem. But for me, I just wanted to explain why those three reasons are why I view Clinton to be the option that is less detrimental in the near term.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with what you said about the rhetorical aspect of what would make Trump potentially deleterious. Even though I think that aspect of his candidacy has been exceedingly overemphasized. So it's worth considering, right? You can't ignore it at all. But the level of attention that gets at the expense of all else, I think has just been incredibly excessive and harmful.
No, I completely agree. And I think to go back to the point you made about the damage that it does for people to kind of make the assumption you're talking about that they don't need to give any reasons why Clinton is better than Trump. This has the horrible consequence, and this is one of the main reasons I'm voting third party and encourage people to vote third party to keep bargaining power within the Democratic Party, of normalizing a lot of the stuff that Clinton does and not holding her accountable for things that are really destructive for people. So I 100% agree with you that the level of discourse in this campaign, especially from prominent Clinton supporters, prominent DNC officials, has been really destructive. I think that one has a very good case to make if one wants to make the strategic case for voting for Clinton. I disagree with it, but I think you can make an intellectually honest, compelling case to do that. The problem is most people aren't making that intellectually honest and compelling case. And so for people who are like you and me and really want to have like good substantive debates and care about good policy, I think it just further alienates people and convinces them that something different is necessary because the Democratic Party is not the part of the solution that we really need.
Yeah, and you know, I've been clear about this from the outset since he first made the proposal in December 2015. But I've always felt that the Muslim ban alone compels opposition to Trump. Now, I get accused by cynical personalities on Twitter of being a stealth-Trump supporter for all sorts of stupid reasons, but that's been my position all along. I've been very consistent about it, just because the damage that would do to that one particular vulnerable cultural subgroup, I think itself warrants opposition to the candidacy. So that that's all notwithstanding any kind of other calculus that we might want to sort out. And so my question, would you allow that, just as there is a reasonable argument to be made that Clinton is the preferable choice, so the begrudged Clinton voter has some sound reasons why he or she would vote that way? I mean, is there a case that's at least sound that a person who assigns the most weight to, say, the TPP question and the foreign policy question in the way that we just framed it, do they have a sound rationale for voting for Trump under those circumstances? Like, is it at least tenable? Is it not just like totally deluded and crazy and wacko and racist and everything else? I mean, is there some kind of rational case there underneath the surface potentially?
So I guess what I would say is those two issues, I think you can have a debate about those two issues. If somebody really cares about those two issues more than all the other stuff, they could have a coherent argument. However, I guess what I would say is it is hard for me to understand how somebody who would be aligned with me in principle on my social justice goals could come to that conclusion. Based on all of the other stuff that I just mentioned and we talked about. I mean, it is very hard for me to, and I've talked to a lot of Trump voters when I was campaigning for Bernie during the primary. I spoke with a lot of them on the phone. I spoke with some of them in Maryland when I was canvassing. And these are not crazy people, right? They come across as very reasonable people. Most were really willing to have a conversation with me when I did talk to people. So I do hate the demonization of Trump supporters, and I think it's really important to listen to people's reasons when they support something. However, at the same time, I also think it's really important to point out to people when they're being intellectually inconsistent or when their stated goals deviate from the action that they're supporting. And that's kind of my view with the Democratic Party, and it's my view with the Republicans. Like, I think it's totally fine if you want to say, here are my values, they're different from yours, and this is why I support Donald Trump, or here are my values and they're different from yours, and this is why I support Hillary Clinton. But one of the things I said during the primary, if you're going to tell me a $15 minimum wage is your top issue, and then you're endorsing Hillary Clinton as the SEIU did, there's a disconnect there. That doesn't make sense. And similarly, I would say, like, if you're going to tell me that foreign policy and the TPP are not the only things you care about, the only things that you care about, I would say we can have an interesting discussion about those two issues, but I would find it hard to believe, again, that we're aligned on our general perspective if you think Trump is preferable.
Yeah, and you know, it just, and the reason why I say that is because I was also a Bernie voter and a supporter, and as you know, an advocate of his to whatever extent, you know, was my role to be during the primaries. And one thing that I noted over the course of the primary, even up till now, and I wrote a piece on this for the Daily Beast that was published a few weeks ago. I don't know if you happen to see it, but there is definitely a segment of the Bernie supporter base that does see Trump as a more viable option in furthering their own interest. Now, you could disagree with their reasoning, and I probably would, but they do exist, and I think there's been sort of a systematic attempt to deny that they exist, despite polling data, despite anecdotal evidence, despite a whole host of other factors which clearly indicate that this does exist. It might not be enough, anywhere near enough to tip the election necessarily, but
no, it definitely exists. I agree with you.
But and to me, automatically discounting their reasoning, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, and I think, you know, it's admirable that you would at least try to entertain what they're saying in a fair-minded way, but, you know, the dominant attitude is to just reflexively discount them as sort of lunatics, right?
Right, and I think that's I completely agree with you. I think that is very counterproductive.
Yeah, but so let's say someone theoretically, their single most important issue is TPP, so that's what they will decide their vote based on. That's the principal reason why they decided to support Bernie versus Clinton. Maybe they showed up to the Democratic convention and waved the no TPP signs in the crowd, as was probably the most popular sign waved there. Remember, so that's their top issue, and they see Clinton, who now we have speech transcripts documenting that she went to all these Wall Street firms and was touting the how tremendous of a big league deal the TPP was. And we have Trump, who over the course of his campaign, even you know, much to the consternation of the free marketeer element of the Republican coalition, has been consistent in opposing the TPP. So, like, you would have to say, you know, say this narrow sliver of Trump of former Bernie supporters is persuaded that Trump's position on this sole issue, which they put at the top of their priority pyramid, compels a vote for Trump. You know, I don't think that's delusional. I mean, I think that makes sense, just in terms of the way I just laid it out, right? So you'd have to provide, you know, countervailing reasons as to why no, actually Clinton is preferable, even notwithstanding the TPP thing.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right that you need to provide the countervailing reasons. And again, if I were having a conversation with those voters, I think you're 100% right that they exist. I would say, one, again, look at Trump's staff. I think you're right that Trump and Clinton, left to their own devices, have very different inclinations. I also think that this is a big plank of the Trump platform, so it it does strike me as unlikely that Trump would reverse even given his staffs. But
But hold on a second, just to interrupt quickly. I mean, is there a staffer of his right now that you are aware of that you can name as somebody who would prod him to deviate from his TPP stance, or is it just the general sense that he's going to bring in generic Republican people? Because if you look at just his campaign staff, which is pretty small, I mean, one of his chief speechwriters, this guy Miller, I think he's like 31 or something. He was the speechwriter for Jeff Sessions, senator from Alabama, and now he's sort of I don't want to use the term intellectual necessarily because it sounds flattering, but he's the intellectual force behind Trump now, such as there is an intellectual force. And he's very staunchly against TPP. And, I mean, do you have anything in mind in particular that...
So I was actually not thinking of staff, but I was thinking of Mike Pence, so just as an example. But yeah, no. So, and again, we don't know on that issue what it would be, but I would point that out, that it's not clear cut, because Clinton will have some pressure from the Democratic Party to adhere to her new TPP stance. I agree with you; it's not likely she would, but she would have some pressure. Trump would have some pressure in the other direction. So I would just point that out. The second thing that I would point out to those Bernie turned Trump voters with TPP at the top of the pyramid, if that's who they are, is I try to engage them in a conversation about other issues, and I think the consequences of single issue voting. I mean, personally, I am a very multi-issue voter, and I think that there are really important reasons to think about a lot of issues in an overall policy framework rather than isolated issues. So I'd hope to have that conversation with those voters, and perhaps at the end of the day, I have to accept that they have a disagreement with me, and it may be that disagreement again is we have very different values when it comes to a multifaceted policy response and everything else on the domestic agenda. But we should have that conversation, and we definitely need to acknowledge they exist, and we need to listen to people. I think that's really important. I just, again, would be trying very hard to make the case that Trump is not the option that is best for anyone.
I think I want to clarify. I don't want to be seen as avoiding the issue.
I don't think you are. I think you're asking good questions.
No. Not that you would necessarily accuse me of that, but others may. Who knows? It's just that in the pure dichotomy, Trump versus Clinton, who is preferable? One of the reasons why I've chosen to abstain. So the reasons are multifaceted. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, was this issue of delegitimizing the outcome and restricting the mandate of the winner. But another is that I genuinely have a level of uncertainty about who is preferable just in that narrow dichotomistic framework that I don't feel I can recommend with any confidence who would be better. I mean, that's just my genuine position. I think there are sound arguments in either way, but I think there's enough ambiguity for me personally that it's another reason to just simply abstain and say I simply don't know what the correct choice is. And maybe that's I think that's in large part due to the foreign policy issue, which I focus on quite a bit.
Do you worry about the variance at all with Trump?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's that's one reason why I'm uncertain, because there is definitely variance. But on foreign policy, even minor gradations of variance can have hugely consequential impact, right? So doing a no-fly zone versus not doing a no-fly zone, I mean, that's World War III or not, right? Potentially. So yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the Russia thing is gotten to a level where it's that bad that I think it really does need to be risen in terms of the precedence it's given in this calculation.
No, so I again wholly agree about the Russia thing being awful. I mean, this is a large part of my reason for voting third party is all of what I said about Clinton being preferable to Trump, which to me is very clear aside. I think that the differences between them are not nearly enough to justify letting the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton traipse into office with the votes of people who want to hold them accountable for those sorts of things. Because I think we do that, we lend credence and legitimacy to the types of things that the Democratic Party do and lose all of our bargaining power over making them not do this pernicious stuff with really long-term consequences. So, I mean, for me, again, the reason that I'm a third-party voter, despite feeling much less uncertain than you about how I'd weight Clinton relative to Trump, is I think the difference of Clinton relative to Trump is much smaller than the risk of allowing the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton to do what they've done during this campaign, and to have a nominee with the record that Clinton has, and know that they're going to get the left flank of the United States population just because we're scared of Republicans. I think that is a much scarier thing, and has very severe long-term consequences than the differences between Clinton and Trump.
Yeah, and they've really exaggerated what differences do exist between the two candidates as the main reason why everyone must rush out and vote for Clinton, right? Trump is just that scary and that fascistic even, that whatever your misgivings about Clinton, the proper and just and righteous thing is to shut up and vote for her. And I just also want to clarify that this posture that I've adopted of uncertainty isn't always my posture. I mean, in 2012, I said clearly, and I can cite what I said at the time, that I felt Obama was clearly the preferable choice over Romney.
I read your piece on that. I thought it was good.
Yeah. And a big reason for that was the foreign policy stuff that I'm preoccupied with right now. I mean, especially the re-empowerment of the neocons that Romney pledged, which now Hillary is pledging. So when you talk about staff, yeah, Michael Flynn and Giuliani and these other ghouls are definitely worrisome. But Hillary, I mean, she's almost guaranteed to elevate neoconservatives back into positions of power, and they've been out of power for 8 years under Obama. She wants to bring them into her grand interventionist coalition, right? So I think that, when you talk about staff, I mean, I think that needs to be considered as well.
No, I think that's worrisome, and again, I think some of the strongest critiques of Clinton are on foreign policy.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, we think we covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything else outstanding that we should touch on?
So
there was some thought that I had about 15 minutes ago that I was going to bring up. That's escapes me now, but maybe it'll come back. Did you have something?
Well, so the only thing I was going to say, and I think this is very much in the spirit of what we were talking about. I mean, my pitch during this election season is really that most Clinton voters, not the prominent ones who are out there smearing you as a stealth Trump supporter, right, and making things up like that, advancing some of these facetious arguments. But I think most Clinton supporters, even some who voice some of these arguments, are people who are mostly with us in principle about wanting to advance a comprehensive social justice agenda, thinking that we need change, thinking that a lot of U.S. foreign policy is really horrible and wrong. I think there are a large contingent that are with us, and that our coalition is actually very broad, and that's one of the reasons that I was most excited about the Bernie Sanders campaign and how well I do think he did, because I think it showed how much energy there is for that sort of policy. I mean, there were a lot of Clinton voters who advanced an incorrect argument about her electability as the reason they were supporting her, but were like, I actually like Bernie's ideas better. And that's a whole different issue. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think, broadly speaking, most people, I think, who are in the Democratic Party, especially people who are younger in the Democratic Party, are generally aligned with us. And so my pitch is to try to make sure that that we are listening to those people, they are listening to us, and there's a lot less casting people who disagree with us as privileged, casting people who disagree with us about electoral strategy as not caring or as being stealth Trump supporters, or even casting people who disagree with you and me of being disingenuous for making a strategic vote for Clinton. I'm not saying that you've done that or that I'm doing that, but I think that sometimes that can happen for people who are upset about the way third-party voters and non-voters are treated. That can be the response. And so I guess what I'm saying is I think it's really important, and my pitch is for all of us to try to listen to each other, and if we are broadly aligned on the social justice agenda, to recognize we might have different electoral strategies, different evaluation of trade-offs, but that ultimately we're going to be working on things together, and we should keep in dialogue about how best to make that happen.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and one of the pitfalls of experiencing politics in large part through the internet, and I guess even Twitter in particular, is that these people with outsized personalities who do advance these very disingenuous, cynical arguments end up dominating your conception of what the nature of the supporters of the candidate are. And I always try to take account of that and not be swept up by it, right? Because I've gotten a lot of vicious trolling from a lot of Clinton people lately. Because that's I guess you could say it's my journalistic focus at this point, pointing out flaws with the Clintons, plural.
Which I think is such an important focus. And again, I just want to say I really appreciate the journalism that you do, because somebody who is power balancing and social justice minded on these issues, having that focus is very rare right now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and your piece on the way that the concept of privilege is being misappropriated to denigrate third-party voters, I think was very well done.
Thank you.
And on the point of the trolls versus the non-trolls thing, most Clinton voters that you'll encounter in everyday life are very just pleasant, normal people who have normal ambitions for what they want the country to look like and how they want to improve their own lives, right? And it's the same for Trump people, in large part. You're going to have exceptions, obviously. But that's why I don't. The emphasis in the media sphere is on trolls on Twitter as representative of the Trump supporter base, I think is so distorting and so pernicious, and that's why I don't want to do the mirror image of that for the Clinton people. So I've actively tried to resist that temptation. I don't know. What do you think of that? I mean, do you think that's been a flaw of how things have proceeded thus far? And you can actually see its antecedent, or antecedent, I guess you pronounce that word, in the Bernie bro thing, right?
I was just going to say that. Yeah, no.
So people do it with you could do it with any candidate at this point. So it's always disingenuous. It's always used as a cudgel to attack the candidate or his supporters. I don't know. So what do you make of that trend? I think it's really dangerous, and you see it with Corbyn actually in the UK.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I think what you said is the right approach, right? We have to remind ourselves that we don't want to be doing what is done to Bernie supporters during the primary, in terms of there's a few random trolls, some of who aren't even Bernie supporters, and therefore all Bernie supporters are caricatured as something that they're not. We don't want to do that to supporters of any candidate. I think we want to, again, make sure that we're holding people accountable for making intellectually honest arguments, probing what people's values are, and hopefully making a compelling moral case, because I do think that most people, when pressed, will be with us, and polling evidence suggests this, at least on domestic economic issues, for example, to support an agenda much more similar to Bernie's than to Hillary Clinton's, for example. So I think we want to make that intellectual and moral case, and then just convey to people that this is our approach, right? We want to listen to you. We want to hear you. We do respect all the arguments you make that are intellectually honest, and we want to have this open dialogue, because ultimately I think there is a lot that we can work on together.
Yeah, I think that's a good sentiment. And the point that I wanted to make 20 minutes or so ago that I forgot, I now remember, and I guess we could semi-wrap up with this, just get your thought on. So you mentioned that in broad strokes, the coalitional differences between a generic Republican candidate and a generic Democratic candidate would, push one and say our position, so to say, to support the generic Democratic candidate because they are going to be subject to pressure from their left flank, whereas the coalitional imperatives within the Republican Party generally tug people to a more reactionary or free marketeer position. Um, and I think, I think there's some merit to that. I do think there's a realignment underway. It materialized somewhat this year, but I still think it's slightly in nascent form. So the coalitional imperative distinction, as traditionally conceived, I think is shifting somewhat. Now, it may still hold to justify seeing the Democratic coalition as preferable this year, but I think it's a fluid situation. Um, and having a Republican president who is anti-free trade, at least nominally anti-intervention ish, and so on and so forth, that would have a major effect on the coalitional composition of both parties. And one thing that I've heard a number of times when speaking to Bernie people who have flirted with supporting Trump, or even some who have said that they are going to vote for Trump. And again, this is not in any sense the majority; it's a minority, but it still exists. Is that there's a theory? So you probably have two, or you have a number of classes of people who would be a Bernie supporter who are flirting with Trump. One is Bernie tended to get a lot of support among rural whites, especially rural downscale whites. So one of my favorite facts from the primary process is the county in which Bernie did best in California was a Northern California county that had the lowest median household income in the state, and was also one of the most white and most rural counties. That's where he performed best in terms of the counties in California. So you have some people in that group who are maybe more conservative, who supported Bernie because for a whole host of reasons, and they might be a little more likely to support Trump, or at least be in this category of Bernie, so people who are likely to support Trump. And then you have a group who are probably a smaller number, but nevertheless exist, who are more left-wing ideological types, who have a theory that were Trump to win, it would be just disruptive to, again, the system of rival coalitions and so on and so forth. And it could lead to the emergence of a strengthened left wing within the Democratic Party. And I don't know whether this has credence or not, but I think it's arguable. It's arguable that if Clinton were to lose, so what the hell? She lost to a beauty pageant proprietor, who in reality TV show candidate. I think that will go a long way in discrediting Clintonism, probably permanently, and that brand of Democratic politics. So there'd be some force, some Bernie-esque force, that would emerge or become ascendant within the Democratic Party were Trump to win. And I think Trump would be highly vulnerable to losing in 2020 to this theoretical left-ish insurgent. So I mean that makes a certain degree of sense to me. I don't know that I would endorse it as the likeliest outcome, but it's not crazy. And that's what you hear from some people who think that a Hillary win would actually suppress the chance of that happening, because everybody would have to fall in line behind Hillary, and the whole party infrastructure would be hers. What do you make of that?
So I think there's high variance here too, I guess is what I would say. I think you're right that there's a theory about what would emerge from the ashes, so to speak. I think that the countervailing theory to that, which I believe Noam Chomsky laid out, and I think definitely has a compelling rationale as well, is something like that happens, things get really awful, and the people who are blamed are Bernie supporters, the left, and it actually sets progressivism back in the long run, because we're just going to get hit really hard for all the consequences of the bad stuff that happens. So I think that is one possible counter reaction as well. I mean,
I think that theory is arguable as well, and the historical analog would be, Democrats were desperate to put forward whoever had the best chance of beating George W. Bush in 2004. So they rallied behind John Kerry, who was pretty much in the center of the party, right? And they beat back left-wing opposition because the overriding goal was to just get some kind of moderate, hawkish conventional candidate. Whereas after 8 years of Obama, the Democratic coalition is kind of sought something new, which is why Bernie gained momentum.
Right.
So I think they're a rival. I mean, I think those are two plausible scenarios. I don't know which one happened, but they're both plausible.
No, I agree with that. I mean, the other thing I was going to say that I think sometimes gets discounted when people talk about the difference between Republican and Democratic presidents is, in some ways, a Democrat's able to enshrine bipartisan consensus around an issue in a way the Republican can't. So people are very tribalistic, and you were talking about that before in terms of, suppose Trump were the person who won the election, would the Republican Party experience a sea change on trade? Maybe, because a lot of Republicans are tribalistic, and if that's what the Republican nominee is doing, that's what they'll support, and maybe that'll change the overriding Republican consensus. However, the reverse side of that is, suppose Barack Obama takes office after George W. Bush, and Democrats have spent the last 8 years railing against the Patriot Act and secrecy, and then Obama continues those policies, and all of a sudden it's somewhat quiet in the Democratic Party about those issues. So I do think that the enshrining, the tribalistic nature of a lot of how voters think about the party system and how people engage with our political system in response to who's president is something that we need to actively combat, not just every 4 years, but during presidencies as well. And again, one of the reasons that I'm a third-party voter is I think it's really important to get out of that tribalistic mindset and to say, the Democratic Party might be better than the Republicans, but they are not doing right by the populations that they're supposed to be doing right by, and so we've got to stand for something different.
Yeah, I almost wholeheartedly agree with what you just said. I think that'd probably be a good note to end on. I hope you found this conversation edifying, and our viewers who are tuning in right now did as well, and people who will view it in the future will be awestruck at our brilliance.
No, this was great. Thank you so much, Michael, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and people who are watching now and in the future should follow Ben Spielberg, right? And most of them probably came through Twitter, so we'll see your handle and they'll follow your stuff in the coming days, months, and hopefully years. Alrighty.
Thank you so much again.
Take care.
All right.